experience. Oh, okay, the recording's starting now. I forgot about that. So I rode a little before that, but I mainly coxed for Saugatuck. I coxed for the Saugatuck boys, and I also coxed heavily for the Saugatuck Masters. I would encourage anyone here to cox for the Masters. I just won the Women's Points Trophy at Masters Nats, in case you want to hear me brag about myself. But it would definitely coxing Masters was like the highlight of my high school, and that really got me to Cornell, and that was how I got better as a coxswain. And I think Rena's had a different experience. She comes from CRI, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Hey, I'm Rena. I also help Katie with the CoxswainResources page. We also have Zoom calls in the winter with another clinic. But yeah, I'm a junior. I live in the Boston area and I cox for CRI on the Charles. And yeah, I have a different experience with coxing than Katie. I tried out when I was a freshman to be a rower because I was looking for a way to get into rowing, but I was too small to row. So I became a men's coxswain. And this is my third year on the CRI varsity boys squad. And yeah, I'm just super excited that you guys are all here, and feel free to write any questions in the chat. Katie and Jimmy and I will all be like chatting a little bit. Jimmy has an awesome presentation, and then we'll answer any questions that come in the chat. So yeah, we're just excited to get to know you guys and to give some pointers on fall racing.
All right, so now we'll let Jimmy take it away. He's a really amazing coxswain that has years of experience, especially on the Cornell men's heavyweight team and on like the junior national team, U23 team. So he definitely has some interesting perspectives to share with us. This is kind of a continuation of our spring racing clinic that happened with Izzy Wise in the spring. So now we have our fall racing that's going to focus on the head race points to get you ready for this year.
Awesome. Thanks, Katie. Can everybody hear me okay? Good to go? Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for that intro. I'm super excited to be here. I've been working on this presentation. I said, if you have any questions, throw them in the chat. We kind of want to make this more of a discussion than anything else, but sort of a guided discussion. Before we do that, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. So I am older than Katie and Rena. I graduated high school in 2005 and coxed at a small prep school in South Jersey, and then coxed at Cornell. And in between there was on the men's junior national team. We won a gold medal, and then was on the United States U23 team the following year. I also, you can just see a couple other things here. I've coached a bunch of like summer rowing camps, coached at a couple colleges, and then various high schools and stuff. And then recently have started the Coxswain Clinic. So what the Coxswain Clinic is a way to try and get more knowledge out to the coxswain community. So I have some contact info at the end of this presentation, and this presentation will go out to everybody. There'll be a link to it. It's being recorded. So it's going to be sent out probably tomorrow, or certainly within the next couple of days, to everybody. And if you want to learn more about either CoxswainResources or Coxswain Clinic, there's information here on how to do so. So without further ado, let's get to all why you're here. So we're going to cover three things today. We're going to go from general to specific. So first, we're just going to cover some general coxing tips. For some of you, the general coxing tips are going to be very elementary, and you may know all of them already, and you may even have maybe different opinions on them. But for some of you, they may be really advanced. So what we try to do is really strike a balance and give just sort of a general overview. And then we'll get a little bit more specific and talk about fall racing, but sort of generally, just in general fall racing strategies. And then lastly, we're going to get super specific and talk about the head of the Charles racecourse. And I'm really interested to hear what some different thoughts are about attacking the head of the Charles, because I have my own opinions on that. I have coxed the head of the Charles. I was trying to remember. I think I've coxed it 7 times. I think it might be 8. I'm trying to remember, but have a completely different experience every time. I've coxed it when the course has been shortened. I've coxed it in the snow. I've coxed it in 70 degrees, in a headwind, in a tailwind, et cetera. And I'm sure Rena, being with CRI, has a lot of experience on the river as well. So interested to hear your thoughts about that. And like I said, ask questions, throw them in the chat. And we're going to try and get to everything. This is technically scheduled to go an hour, but if we end up going over an hour, that's totally fine. We're here until you want to kick us out. So let's start with some general coxing tips. And when we were putting this together, this isn't like the Coxswain Clinic and Coxswain Resources, overview on coxing. That would be a different presentation. What this is we looked at the questions that you all submitted and what you wanted to hear about. And we divided those up into those 3 categories you saw. And this first slide is an attempt to answer questions that you had generally about coxing. So this isn't like Jimmy's top 5 rules of coxing. That would be different. So this is more answering some of the questions that we got from you all. But as with everything, rule number 1 is safety. So if you're just starting out coxing, rule number 1, safety, hard stop, period. No exceptions. And that is whether you are practicing, racing, if you are in the grand final of the last race of the year, or if you are in the first practice of the year, which may just be happening now, your first job is safety of your crew, safety of yourself, safety of your boat and your equipment. So don't let anybody kind of tell you otherwise or steer you off course, no pun intended, with respect to that rule. Your job is safety. Everything else is kind of secondary to that. But from there, let's just sort of go with an overview of coxing sort of technique, if you want to call it that. So the 2 things that I think are sort of quote unquote important when you talk about coxing technique is how to steer, and not necessarily how to steer a straight course, but physically, where do you put your hands? So let's talk about coxing 8. If you're coxing an 8, you're going to be in the back of the boat. So that is a picture of me coxing. It's in an 8, so I'm in the stern. And I want to focus in on the left hand for a second. So if you can see that and focus on that for a second, the pinky and the ring finger are going to be wrapped around the gunnel. So you're kind of holding on the outside of the boat. And then the other 3 fingers on your hand, your thumb, your middle finger, are wrapped around the knob that's looped through the cables. So you hold the knob with those 3, your other 2 fingers wrap around the side. And what that does is it gives you some stability. And what I used to do is put a little piece of like athletic tape at exactly where straight was. So if the boat's in slings, you can look at where the rudder is exactly straight. And then where your hand is going to sit, put a little piece of tape underneath the gunnel or on top. And then you have that reference point without having to look down or kind of guess if you're going straight, because like your middle finger or your ring finger is sort of rubbing against that piece of tape. And you then know that you're tracking perfectly straight in that instant. The other sort of technical thing that I usually suggest is try and sit up straight. So you'll see some coxswains that will bend forward and try and lean down forward. And the best explanation that I've heard for why coxswains do that is it's a little bit more aerodynamic. You kind of get lower in the boat and your head dips down. I don't really think that makes sense personally for 2 reasons. The first is you're not really going fast enough to affect aerodynamics. You're going at a maximum of like maybe 18-ish miles an hour, like if you're moving. And that's just not fast enough to really have an aerodynamic effect. It's certainly something as small as a human body. And secondly, you're going to be shorter than your stroke seat in all likelihood. So your stroke seat is breaking the wind in front of you anyway. So even if you're sitting up straight, it's going to be going over your head to the extent there is wind. Secondly, if you are sitting up straight, it allows you to press your back, kind of the bottom of your tailbone and the bottom couple of vertebrae that you have against the back of the boat, and it gives you more of an anchor. And with that, you can kind of sit up a little straighter, anchor your back against the back of the boat, and it gives you the ability to remain still. capitalized on the slide there, and I think it's really important. I'm sure for you have definitely seen the coxswains that every time the boat checks, their body goes forward and comes back, and then it goes forward and comes back. You've definitely seen that. You want to try and avoid that as much as possible. You don't want to be taking your 100 pounds or 125 pounds and throwing it forward and backward all the time. So what you can do is you try and anchor yourself by, again, sitting up a little bit straighter and holding your core a little tighter. And I want to give you a video of what I think is a really good example of being still in the boat. This is a video of the boat race between Oxford and Cambridge, and it's a close-up of the Coxswain Fall, I think it's the Oxford boat. And you'll hear, if assuming the audio works, you'll hear the commentators actually talking about how calm and still the coxswain is. So let's take a look at this for about 15 or 30 seconds.
Stroke oar is not on the stroke side, it's actually on the right-hand side as you...
Chasing... that A and want to save time on proofreading, Grammarly makes editing
look how
one click simple.
still the coxswain
Look starboard side as he would look down the boat from the Cox's viewpoint. But
and
there, the view
calm.
that Jack Topham has of Tobias Schroeder, Angus Groom behind him, Charlie Elwes, Roman Roosley, Jack Robertson, Barnaby Delause, and David Ambler, Liam Corrigan.
He's conveying them the information they need and using that to provide the motivation. What you don't want to do in a commanding position is get overly excited and increase the chances of making a mistake. And
we apologise for the overexcitement again from the Coxies, but yeah, let's look at his heart rate and just think pleasant thoughts.
I think it's interesting how they show his heart rate at the end there at 161. I think that's awesome. And I thought that was just a good example of sitting up straight in the boat and being still and remaining calm. So one of the things that you may have seen in the advertisement for this clinic was a little bit of audio and recording analysis. So what I would do is when you get this slide, go back and watch that video and listen to that coxswain. Particularly for head races, and we'll get into this. One of my main things that I try and teach is remaining calm and not what I refer to as rah-rah, just the screaming your head off, telling everyone to pull as hard as you can. To me, I don't do a lot of rah-rah. It's more information, and it's presented in a calm, cool, and collected manner. And I think that Jack, the coxswain in that video, does a really good job of presenting information in that kind of way rather than just screaming his head off. In a way, you have to trust that your athletes are pulling as hard as they can or pushing as hard as they can. And when they're in the middle of the race, it may not be the best thing for you just to be screaming to get a little bit more out of them. They may need information rather than encouragement. So this is something in terms of how to make calls. We got lot of questions that were similar to this, like how to make calls, what calls to make, how to structure calls during a race. And I want to go through sort of my theory on how to make a call as a coxswain. So what I do is, you'll see it here, I think of the rowing stroke as a clock. And what I mean by that is, if you picture a clock, you have 12 at the top, obviously 6 at the bottom, and the hands go around. So if you picture the finish of the stroke is the top of the clock, and then the catch is the bottom of the clock, and then the release, the finish, you're back up at the top. And that stroke just goes around and around and around and around. If you're going to make a call that affects the finish, right? You want to make that call, if you intend for it to be on the next stroke, you want to make it at 1 o'clock, just after that point in the stroke that it just happened. So what I mean by that is, if you're going to say, I want to pause at the finish, you want to make the pause at the finish and make that call right after the rowers go through the finish. And that way you're giving them the most amount of time possible to absorb what you just said and say, oh yeah, all right, we're going to pause on this one. And if you say this one at the catch, it's super confusing. Do you mean like this one literally, like right now as we're driving through the water, or do you mean like the next one? If you give them that call right as they come out of the water and their hands are coming away, that's very clear exactly what you mean. So if you're rowing, again, like sort of picturing it as a clock, if they come through noon, if they come through the finish, it's now like arms away, 1 o'clock, bodies over is maybe like 3 o'clock, coming up the slide, 4 or 5 o'clock, 6 is the catch. You're making that call at 1 o'clock. So right as they come out of the water, their hands away, you want to say, we're going to pause on hands away, this one. And then they're like, all right, I got it. We're going to pause here, this one. If you say it right at the finish, again, it's a little confusing. Do you mean like literally right now? Do we take another stroke or not? So that one's a little bit difficult to kind of conceptualize without going through it all in the water. But think about, you're going to make a call next time you're in the boat. When is the best time within the rowing stroke to make a call related to the stroke? And usually it's right after you go through that point that you're talking about. I'll kind of pause there for a second and ask Katie or Rena, sort of what's your methodology if you want to chime in and all. You don't have to at all, but if you do, sort of on sort of technique of making calls and that sort of thing.
I would totally agree with what you said, especially thinking like catch and finish. And like you don't want to be saying something pertinent to the drive on the recovery. And that's like a really important call. And then I would say that something that I struggled with a lot as a junior coxswain, especially in my earlier years, was talking like way too much. So I would say that a lot of times when you're younger, you're too focused on making calls almost compared to other things. And sometimes what you're saying isn't as valuable. So I would say like the next practice that you have, the next race that you have, is really thinking about what you're saying and the meaning behind it and making sure everything you're saying is meaningful. Because going back to like that whole point about being calm, like you want to be communicating to your rowers as clearly as possible. And it's going to be more clear if you're not just like bombarding them with words.
Yeah, and then adding on to
Absolutely.
that, as well as being quiet, like when you're making calls, you want to think about like the effect they're going to have on your rowers. So like what Jimmy was saying is like, you don't want to just be screaming at your rowers and like telling them to push harder. Because in reality, I find that my rowers often need is they just need the information, because that's if you tell them that you're sitting one seat down on the competing crew, like, and give them a way to like make that move rather than just screaming at them, like they're gonna register it so much more. And there's also something about like not just using the same tone. Like if you're always shouting and yelling like what you think of as motivational things at them, there's going to be no variation in your thing. Think about it as rather like give them the information, tell them how you're going to make it, and then you can be more aggressive when you're making that move. But just think about like varying your tone. Don't always be just talking really like in a monotonous way. But at the same time, like you don't want to always be screaming. Like you want to make sure you're looking for variety.
One of the things that you can do is if you find an audio recording of a coxswain online, just pay attention to your own attention span during that recording. And if you play a coxswain's recording that's on the head of the Charles, for example, if you're listening to that coxswain's recording and you're a coxswain, you're listening to it, you are trying to learn from it. And if you find yourself mentally checking out, or your mind is wandering a little bit, and then you're like, oh, I haven't listened to like a minute of what he or she said, and then you kind of check back in, then you know that their voice was a little bit monotonous or it was a little bit repetitive or something. And if you're doing that when your focus was like trying to learn something from this person, imagine what a rower is going through trying to like listen to that coxswain. They are going to completely shut them out. So if you found a video where you're engaged the whole time and you're listening and you like a minute, 2, 3, 4 minutes go by and you're like hanging on every word that this coxswain says, that's very good delivery. And you want to think about what that coxswain did to hold your attention that whole time. I think we have a question, a hand raised. Gabriella Shires, question?
Yes, I just wanted you to explain once more what you meant when you said think of the stroke like a clock. Like, I understand, but not like completely. So I just want to make sure I understand fully.
Yep, sure. So good question. Sorry about that. So what I mean by that is, and I'll kind of back up for a second and show you a little bit more, like using my movement to kind of mimic the rowing stroke. But what you want to do is think of when you're at the finish here, that's going to be, for me, it's 12 o'clock, right? So you're at the top of the clock and then you're starting to go around. So as the arms come away, the clock is going around, you're like at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock is the catch. And then 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 is the finish here. And the reason why it's important in my mind to think of it as a clock is it gives me a really easy reference point of when I want to make a call. And my call is I make it at the next hour, sort of overcomplicating it. But what I mean by that is if I'm going to make a call about the finish is 12 o'clock, it's here. So I'm going to make a call at the next hour, which is which is like right about here, maybe at half arms away or arms away. So as the rowers are coming in, if I'm going to say, we're going to throw in a pause at the finish and they're rowing. So they're coming in here and they're rowing and I'm going to say, all right, we're going to pause at the finish on this one. It's right here. It's just after they go through that point, because then there's no confusion, right? If I say, all right, we're going to pause on this one and they're driving through the water and I say it right there, what do I mean? Are they going to like stop right here? Because then you know what's going to happen. Like 4 of them are going to keep going, 4 of them are going to stop, and it looks messy. But if you make that call right after you go through that point that you're talking about, it leaves no question. So you're going to say, all right, we're going to pause. I got it. We're going to pause here. It gives them the most amount of time. You're giving them 11 hours in terms of the clock to like comprehend what you just said and execute it. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, sure. I think we have another question.
Yeah, I was just wondering, like, how do you use your tone to engage the rowers? Because I've been noticing recently at practice, I feel like my tone has gotten a lot flatter and that makes the boat less focused.
Yeah, totally. And tone is really important. And it's really an underutilized weapon. And I think the most important thing about tone is to start out at a place that's manageable and sustainable. So you don't want to start out at an 8 with your intensity level. So when you're going through the warm-up, particularly if you're a crew that practices in the morning, right? Like half your crew is still waking up. Even if you practice in the afternoon, probably some of your rowers took a nap or something, like they're still waking up, they're still warming up. So you want to start out your practice and have your tone match what you're doing, right? So you'll notice here, just in the last 10 seconds, I've changed my tone, right? So if I'm going to talk about something that's more constant and more sustaining, we're going to be doing warm-ups, we're going to be doing continuous rowing, we're going to be coming through, we're going to be focusing on this, and then we throw in a pause. And then we're going to pause again, and we're going to throw in another pause. You see what I'm doing there is my tone, the manner in which I'm speaking and my rhythm is matching what they're doing. So if they're pausing in the rowing stroke, I'm pausing my speech pattern. So we're going to throw in a pause on every other stroke on this one. Rope, and then they're going to go. So you give them that little pause. And then if, for example, you're doing something that's a little bit more, that you're adding a little bit of pressure, it's got a little bit more weight to it, then you're going to increase the speed that you talk at, you're going to increase your volume a little bit, and you're going to press them. And then you're going to focus, and then you're going to finish the piece and bring everything back down. And now you're finished the piece, you're letting them breathe. So my main, I guess, response to the question would be have your tone match what they're doing. And if it unfortunately is a practice where they're doing a lot of the same thing, you might have to vary that up just a little bit. Like if you're just doing body over pauses for 90 minutes, you can't just have your tone match what they're doing the whole time, because you're never going to change it. So I would say focus on trying to match your tone to what they're doing, whether it's volume, intensity, rhythm, everything sort of can be spread out to match what they're doing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it did. It's just my club is doing a lot of like very technical things currently because it's the start of the season.
Yep.
So it's just been kind of hard to like vary the tone.
Yeah.
But yeah, I get it.
So with those, and that's super common early fall, the coaches are just kind of assessing the rowers. That's really important development for coxswains. So I think even more important than tone is learning what your coach is focusing on and what each rower's, quote unquote problem seems to be and what they respond to. So if you're in an 8 and your 5 seat is being coached over and over and over again on her catch, and it's just her catch, and her catch seems to be a problem, but then your coach makes a call and says light hands, and you notice as soon as your coach says light hands, your rower, all of a sudden their catch gets a lot better, and the coach really starts affirming that, and they're like, yeah, that's much better. You need to make a mental note of that and say, all right, light hands is what she needs to hear when her catch starts to break down, and you file that away. So when you're a mile and a half into the head of the Charles and you notice your 5 seats blades start to go, you can say, all right, light hand, we're going to focus on light hands for these next couple. So instead of focusing on maybe changing up your tone, instead try and internalize a little bit more of technically what your coach is doing and what's working for each of your rowers, and file that away, because that's going to be really good in 6 or 7 weeks when you go down the Charles course or whatever race you're focusing on. I think we have another question from Addison.
Yeah, so kind of similar to what Chloe just asked, but the idea, the thought of, so I'm especially working with novices right now.
Yep.
And like a lot of what we're struggling with is timing, and I've been trying to like focus on making my words happen like when I want, like at certain parts. But I also feel like then it's like as the rhythm is changing constantly, so how do I like keep my voice with the rhythm if the rhythm of the stroke and like the rate isn't being consistent?
So what I would say is you have to decide which one do you want to lead and which one do you want to follow? Do you want your calls to follow the rhythm that your rowers are setting, or do you want your rowers to follow the rhythm that your calls are setting? My guess is you want your rowers to follow the rhythm that you're going to set for them, because then since they're novices, they're kind of still learning. So what I would say is try and keep your calls consistent, even if the rhythm is not. And it might seem weird, like if there's any like musicians out there, like you're kind of, it's on like an offbeat and you're changing the rhythm up a little bit, and like they might catch early, and then so you might call catch like 2 or 3 seconds after they actually catch, but subconsciously they will start to internalize that as, oh, we were all a little bit early and we need to kind of slow down a little bit, because I'm sure like your stroke seat is going to be thanking you because their back's going to really start to hurt because there's like a lot of rush coming up. So what you can do as the coxswain to help them out is you can't physically slow down the rate, like you can't go hold back your rowers because you're kind of in one place. But what you can do is use your calls to give them a target and say, all right, they're catching now, but instead you say catch. So you're like a half a second behind it, suggesting to them that, all right, they're a little bit early, and vice versa. If you want them to speed up a little bit, you can anticipate the catch by like a quarter of a second. If you're trying to get them to sprint, like at the end of the race, you maybe call that catch just a hair early, and it gets them maybe to think like, all right, I'm a little bit behind, when it's just you trying to lift it up a little bit.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So it's one of those situations too where like using a lot of talking may actually be beneficial, like to remind them like we need to be here now and then here now.
Yep. And I would say, rather than thinking of it as a lot of talking, I would think of it as targeted, sharp calls. So you're not speaking throughout the entire stroke. Instead, you're saying 1 or 2 words at 1 or 2 very specific times. So again, you don't want them to drown you out, because if you're talking again through the whole cycle of the stroke, and then they're not going to know when you say catch, because they're going to start drowning you out. But if you don't say anything, catch, then all of a sudden you're getting their attention, because it's silence in between catches. But instead, if you're saying, all right, guys, we really have to focus on this, we got to get our catches in time. All right, let's really do this. Let's get our catch. They're going to drown that out, and that word is just going to disappear. I know there's 2 hands up. I want to get to those, but I want to get through at least this slide. Let's move on to the fall racing one, and then we'll come back. So Charlotte and Liliana, remember your questions. I want to come back to that. Just let's move on just a little bit.
Just as a note,
Um,
you could also post questions in the chat so that you don't have to interrupt the presentation if you're gonna lose your thought.
Sure. Yeah. Great idea. It's just a couple more general coxing tips. We got a couple questions in there that I thought were really good, which were like, what are some small things that you do that you think make a big impact? And I want to pose this question to Rena and to Katie as well, but I'll answer first and let you guys give an opportunity to think about it. The two things that I try and do are, particularly if you're coxing for a club or if you're coxing for a program where the lineup changes every day, learn the names of your rowers. And it seems like something that's kind of a little silly. You can just call them out by number. But in my mind, if you can take the time to learn their names and make it a little bit more personal, then you can say, hey, Charlie, in the bow seat, can you touch it a little bit? Like we have to adjust the point or whatever the case may be, instead of bow seat, touch it. And if you don't feel like learning 8 new names or 4 new names, if you're coxing a 4 every day, what I do is when I get the lineup sent to me from the coach, I screenshot it. So I have it on my phone and I make that my iPhone background for practice. So all I have to do is just tap my phone. That picture comes up because it's my background, like my home screen, and the names are right there. So I have it on my lap while I'm coxing. And if I forget, because I usually do, it's 8 new people every day, whoever's sitting in each seat, I just tap my phone and go right down. All right, it's right there. And when we were launching at 5 a.m., sometimes it's not light out. So even if I were to like write it down or something, I wouldn't be able to see it, but my phone is nice and bright. So a little pro tip there, to make the lineup your home screen. Tap on it, lineups right there. Then you can sort of fool your rowers into thinking you have all of their names memorized when you have no idea what their names are. It's just they're on your phone. And the second thing I'd say is take your job seriously. I don't mean too seriously. You don't have to be a robot, but if you approach each practice with professionalism, and you take turns seriously, even if you're like just doing drills or something, if you start to give the impression that you don't care, or you're just sort of taking the day off, or you're checked out or whatever, your rowers are going to see that. And it's an unfortunate part of coxing, but what's happening with coxing is you have no erg score, right? There's no way for you to objectively show to your coaches and to your rowers that you are better than all of the other coxswains, except through day in and day out, putting in the work and sort of showing your work over time and like your coxing over time. And one of the ways you can do that is you show up every day and you kind of give the same very high level of effort every single day, rather than just sort of saying, something, relatively simple as checking the boat for making sure like all the equipment is tight, like all the bolts and the nuts and everything are tight before you launch. So walk up and down the boat, even if it's upside down or if it's in slings or whatever, and just check everything. And when you get on the water, when nothing's loose and you have like an uninterrupted practice because you did your job and you checked everything ahead of time, your rowers are going to appreciate that. And they're going to say, all right, this coxswain is really making our job easier. We want her or we want him in our boat every single time because we know they're going to make our job easier. Rena and Katie, what do you think about that? What's like kind of some small things you do that you think make a really good, big impact?
Yeah, so I totally agree with the things you were saying. If I were to pick a few, those two would definitely be on the list. I think the thing that I do, slightly more specific, my team is really into doing core circuits. We do them like on days that we're lifting. We do core before we go out. We'll also do it after. And I just find that like if a coxswain, even if it's just one out of the like 5 coxswains on your team, if just one coxswain does core with your rowers, like they totally see it and they respect you so much. Like I'm on a guys team and the guys, like the most trust I build between them is when we're like struggling to do a core circuit or to do a lift like next to each other, because that's just like showing them that you're dedicated. That's part of the like taking your job seriously. Like you don't have to be able to do these things that they're doing, and like the strength that they're building up, they're applying in a more like significant way than you are. But if you think about it, like being next to them and like being with them as they're trying to do something that's like challenging, it's like you're going to build a lot of trust there. And like when I'm like talking to the rowers like after a hard workout, like I think there's definitely like more trust and like a better relationship when they know that like their coxswain is investing energy and time into them, not only on the water, but like working hard on the water, off the water as well. Like during winter training, if you can like hop on a berg or erg next to them, you're not going to go as fast as them, and that's fine. But they're going to like respect you so much for doing it. And then also, I would say, like, ask for their feedback. Like if they're like, like take criticism in appropriate ways, like draw a line. Like if my guys are trying to give me feedback on the water, I'm like, no, this is not the time. But then you talk to them once your boat's away. You talk to them when your boat's in slings. Like look for feedback, look for like you're giving them a ton of feedback and a ton of constructive criticism, and you should be like hungry for that as well. Yeah.
That reminds me, Rena. Oh, sorry, Katie, go ahead.
You could go. I want to hear what you say.
I was just going to give a sort of a funny example of asking for feedback. And like one of my favorite calls back when I was in college was if we were building and the boat was getting better and better and better, and like we were increasing speed and all that, one of my go-to fillers was, "It feels good, doesn't it?" I would shorten it to "don't it," but like "feels good, don't it?" And like it would sort of get everyone thinking kind of more of a positive thing, instead of like your legs really hurt. The boat going fast feels good. Like that feels really good, don't it? Like that feels good, don't it? And then I kind of said it in increasing tones. And I said to my rowers as we were approaching maybe Eastern sprints, I was like, which one of my calls do you really like or really not like? Like, give me some stuff. And one of my rowers said, "Yeah, you don't know this, but we all make fun of you when you say feels good, don't it? Because it sounds like you're saying donut, like donuts, the food. So we all think like you have this thing called a feels good donut. So it kind of just makes us laugh every time instead of pumping us up." And I was like, "I've been doing this for months and you never told me." So it was kind of like a lighthearted thing, but that's to say, if I would have asked for feedback a little bit earlier, they wouldn't be thinking about donuts every time I was trying to do like a power 10. Sorry, Katie. I was reminded of that.
No problem. I like that story. I was just gonna bring an extension to what Jimmy said, and then also what M. King wrote in the chat. So in case you weren't paying attention to the chat, I really liked how they're focusing on like getting to know their team and like getting to know their rowers as an individual. And I'd say that is one thing that I like really work on as a coxswain to like make a big impact to rowers on an individual basis. And it even extends like outside of like rowing, in a sense. Like if you know that someone has a big exam, you could like ask them like how their exam went. And I used to, my funny story is, I used to like memorize every single person on my team's pets. And every single day I would ask them how their pets are doing. I don't do that anymore because one time I had one of them tell me that their cat died and it was really sad. So I would recommend not doing that. But that like is kind of the sentiment. And I would say that extending that into the boat is where I really became able to stand out as a coxswain, because I became the coxswain that people would go to. Like I knew everything. Like if it was an erg test, I would know what times the rowers should be hitting. I would know how they should be pacing themselves. If we were in the boat, I would know every single day Eric bends his outside elbow and keeps his inside arm really stiff. And that's something that my coach really keeps fixing. I would know the rowers as rowers, and I also know them personally to know if they're going to crash in the first minute of a 2K and they just don't know how to breathe properly from the beginning and they need to be reminded on that. So I would just know them. And like to the point where I coxed masters all of last year. And at the end of the season, and when I left and I went to college, someone came up to me and was like, "You're always going to be on my shoulder reminding me to roll up earlier." And that like really made an impact to me. Like, wow, I really helped this guy. And then like I also made this really tough choice to switch teams before my senior year, and I went from coxing the boys to coxing the masters. But even though I wasn't on their team, on the boys team, I was still the coxswain that everyone would go to because I knew them, and like they knew that I would know how to access the results of the race. I would know what time they would be getting in a boat. Like I just stayed on top of my information, and that really made an impact to everyone. So they would come to me.
That's awesome. I agree 100% with all of that. Getting to know your rowers, like learning their names, I kind of think is maybe step one, but then getting to know them on a bit of a more personal level. Like when you cox in high school and college, you kind of can't help it. Like you're going to spend 3 hours a day with all these people, if not more. I lived with my stern pair for 2 years. Like I knew them very, very well. And one of the things that getting to know them does for you is it lets you know when they might be going through something also. Like not every rower on your boat is going to be having a good day every day. So if they have a really hard test or they're going through something in their personal, like non-rowing life, it may mean that on that day, don't go after them too hard. Like if something's wrong in their rowing stroke, maybe have that battle with them tomorrow, when they get through the big test or whatever's going on in their personal life, and they will appreciate that. If, you don't want to add to what's going on by saying, not only is all this stuff going on in your personal life, but your catch really stinks. You can kind of stay off of them that day. Just tell them you're here to support them. Good luck with everything, and they can row however they want today. And it's maybe a little bit of a short-term loss for a long-term gain, so to speak. One of the questions we got, which I thought was a really good one that I want to go quickly through, is my favorite drills. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I do want to describe it for everyone. It's not a very popular one, but it is my favorite drill. And it is called the Romanian release drill. And if anyone's familiar with this, awesome, congratulations. It is a fantastic drill. And so if you're a novice coxswain, this might be a little bit advanced for your crew. If you're more of kind of a third, fourth, fifth year coxswain, that kind of thing, this might be right in your alley for your athletes and your rowers. So here's what it is. It's a pause at the finish. And when you pause at the finish, the blades are not squared and they're not feathered. They are half feathered. So all 8 are pausing at the finish right after they come out of the water with the blade half feathered. And the bottom part of the blade is just resting right on the water. So it just kind of scrapes it off. When the coach that I had that taught us this drill described it as kind of a knife on top of warm butter. You just kind of like scrape the top off. And what that does is it perfectly sets handle heights the instant after the release. So they are rowing and they are pausing right after they come out of the water with the blade half feathered, resting on the water. So if you have a crew that kind of can't get the boat set and they're having a hard time with that, it's a really good drill to do for like a minute or two. And then you go to maybe every other, you pause every other stroke, and then maybe every third, and they all come through that checkpoint together and then feather it and go. And again, it might be a little bit more advanced for like some of the novice crews or something, but if you have a bit more of an experienced crew, that's one that they might be having a shaky practice. Your coach gives you the authority to call a drill. You call this drill, and the boat starts setting up, they start clicking, and all of a sudden you are the hero of the practice because you figured that out. The boat's now sending a little bit easier, and they're doing a lot better. So that's just sort of one that I thought of. I thought that was a really good question, whoever asked it. So let's go to part 2, which is stuff that's a little bit more specific to fall racing. There is a lot on this slide that's going to show up, so I'm going to go a little bit faster through it because technically we only have 15 minutes and we're only a third of the way through the presentation. So I'm going to move a little bit more quickly through this one, but I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of general fall racing tips, and I'm going to go in order of like leading up to the race itself, and then after the race. So when we talk about race prep, there's a couple things that you want to do for every single head race that you have. And I'm talking only head races right now, which are 5K races, usually involving turns, and they're staggered starts. So boats going every 10 or 15 seconds or so. You don't all start at the same time. The first thing you want to do is you want to learn the course. And that means learning like the geography of the course, but also learning the rules of that course. So some courses have buoys that you need to keep on your right, some on your left. If you miss a buoy, is it a 5-second penalty? Is it a 10-second penalty? Are there any areas where you can pass and you can't pass? what's the obligation on a passing crew or a crew that's being passed? How do you object to a race or a result if you think a crew impeded your path? All of those things, that's on you. That is your job, in addition to steering and calling the race, of course. So knowing the rules is going to help you out. And if we have time, I can tell a couple anecdotes about sort of when the rules came into play and helped us and didn't help us in a couple situations. You want to practice your calls and practice your milestones with the crew. And what I mean by that is go down the race course if you can. Like if you get there a day early and you're running down the race course, make the same calls that you're going to make at the same race milestones that you're going to make them. So let's just use the head of the Charles, for example. If you know you're going to take a 10 coming out of the Weeks Bridge, then during your practice row, take a 10 coming out of the Weeks Bridge and call it the way you're going to call it in the race. It gets you some practice going through it. And it also lets the rowers know this is kind of what it's going to look like. This is what it's going to sound like, et cetera. Another thing is you want to practice your warm up. So know your warm up start to finish, all 45 minutes or 1 hour of it, however long it's going to take. Know it kind of down to everything you want to do, where you want to be at a certain point. T minus 20 minutes, you want to be going by sixes. T minus 16 minutes, you want to be going by eights. At T minus 12 minutes, you want to be doing power tens or whatever. And then do that warm up the day before. Execute it exactly like you're going to execute it the following day or the following week on race day, so that your crew knows, all right, if we launch at 55 minutes before the race, that gets us the entire warm up and they know what to expect. You're not hitting them with a new warm up on the day of. It's something new. You kind of want to keep it as predictable as possible if you're picking up on a theme here. There were a lot of questions about developing a race plan. I would say that's super specific to you and your crew and your coach. But when you do develop it with all three entities. And what I mean by that is the coxswain, the rowers, and the coach. All three of you have to come together to develop a race plan. And that race plan, in my opinion, has to be flexible. I'm sure Rena knows this better than most. Like you're rowing the Charles course, it gets really, really crowded. So sometimes you want to take a 10 at a certain point and you just can't because there's a boat right in front of you or something is happening and you kind of have to pivot a little bit from your race plan. So I'm not a huge proponent of making really specific race plans. But if you do, involve your rowers and involve your coach, that way you have buy-in from everybody. And then the last thing on race prep is practice the turns. It's important for the rowers to practice rowing down the course and kind of get a look at everything and know where they're going. It's also really important for you to practice your turns. So go through, for example, the Weeks Bridge turn or the Elliott Bridge turn at full speed and know what that's like and how hard you're going to be on the rudder. And if you didn't do it right, turn around and do it again. If that practice row and the race prep is for you just as much as it's for the coxswains or for the rowers. So yeah, the rowers need to do their race prep and they need to get in their strokes, but you also need to do your race prep as well. On race day, I would say this goes back to sort of what we were talking about before and getting to know your rowers and knowing what works for them on practice day and on race day. So if you know some of your rowers get like really, really anxious before a race, that maybe your job is to calm them down. And maybe you do that by telling a joke or breaking the ice a little bit, or maybe just giving them their space or learning how they deal with their like race day jitters and understanding that everybody deals with race day jitters differently. So I'm gonna mute everybody. There we go. Making sure that you're presenting yourself in a calm and confident manner and not being like at least externally showing like a lot of jitters and race day anxiety and all of that. And instead, at least my approach was I want to present calm and confident. And that was my approach every race day morning. If it was just kind of smiling, being at the race course early, checking the boat, and just kind of being there as a sort of a little bit of an outlet for the rowers if they might be a little bit more nervous. Again, I may have been super nervous, but I tried not to show that to the rowers. And eventually it's sort of, I made myself less anxious and more calm by acting that way. So we're talking about like race day itself, during your warm-up, you have rehearsed your warm-up the day before. Remember, like you did it exactly. Do it again, exactly the same way. If you change it, explain why you changed it. So you might say to your rowers, we're going to do the same exact warm-up, but then there's a bottleneck and you have to stop and you have to take a pause. Tell them that. So then it's not just this weird, oh, Jimmy's changing his mind on the fly. What's going on? Did he see something in the blade work that's making him change? No, it's because there's a boat in front of us that's going slow. Like everything is going according to plan. We're fine. During warm-ups, I always try and give rowers time to stop. If they want to layer up or layer down, put on extra layers, get dressed. If they want to get fluids or kind of however, if they want to take like a goo or whatever before the race, give them time to do that and let them know you're going to do that. So if you're rowing by 8s and you're getting warmed up, or by 4s, you can say, all right, in about 3 minutes, we're going to stop and I'm going to give you 90 seconds just to kind of do your thing. And that's what I refer to it as, just do your thing. And it just meant whatever you want to do, go do it. And I turned my Cox box off. It was just their time to do their thing. They could look around, they could stretch, they could, eat whatever they needed. Again, since you learned the course already, you're familiar with the rules, you're familiar with the course, you know the traffic pattern and you know the starting queue. So be on time and be where you are supposed to be. The next, so the next part is the race itself. When you're attacking the race itself, there's a couple, obviously these 5 bullet points don't cover everything, but let's try and go through them a little bit and at least hit the high notes. So what I try and do is break the race up into segments. So from this bridge to this bridge, we are going to focus on X. Between the Weeks Bridge and the Lars Anderson Bridge, we are going to be focusing on handle heights. And that's what we're going to focus on. We're going to focus on swing because that's usually where you're going to get a little bit of a headwind if there is one. So that's really where you want to swing and focus on like back end completion and that kind of thing. And what that does is, because a head race can be 20 minutes long, if you're focused the entire time is like that rah, just pull harder kind of stuff, that's going to get stale and get old real quick, like within the first couple of minutes. And then you have no more material. You have 17 minutes left of air to fill and you have nothing to fill it with. So instead, you break the race up into smaller segments and you focus on calmly and confidently presenting information and different kind of technical focuses throughout the piece, rather than just, we got this, pull harder. We got this, pull harder. You're doing great. Like all of that it's good and it's necessary at certain points, but it's a little bit easier to pull that off during the sprint when you're only racing for 6 minutes or 5 minutes or however long it is. If you're racing for 20, you have to have a little bit different presentation. We definitely talked about fluctuating your speech patterns earlier, so I won't cover that again. The third point here is probably the most controversial one that I'm going to present today. And this is why I say that. My philosophy on head racing is this: there are no points for passing. Every coxswain wants to pass crews and you want to pass people left and right, and it feels awesome. In my mind, a perfect race involves not passing anybody and not being passed by anybody. That's why the winner gets bound number 1 the following year. It's the best water. There is no one in front of you for you to pass. Passing is great. It makes it feel really good for your rowers when they pass by somebody or whatever, but it is almost undoubtedly, on balance, it's going to slow you down, even if you're passing somebody, because you are going to be in their wake as you're approaching them, which is going to offset you, and you're going to have to steer around them. Even if they have to yield, we all know no one yields totally out of the way. It's going to cause an issue, so you're going to get off your line. So this is what I do. This is my approach to trying to avoid passing. And I will say it is a little bit risky. So do it with caution if you want to take this advice. But this is what I do. When I'm in the starting queue, I give as much time as physically possible between the boat in front of me and me. a lot of coaches and coxswains will tell you start right up on the boat in front of you, especially if you know you're going to pass them. Like just start right up on them and you can get going and get past them. No, I leave as much room as I can because that gives me better water and it gives my crew better water. There are no points. There's no special thing that happens when you pass a crew. It's just annoying. So what I usually do is tell the crew to start rowing, because eventually you're going to start getting yelled at by the ombudsman or the starter to say, like, you know, whatever your Cornell or whatever crew you're coxing, bring it up. Like, you need to start moving or whatever. I'll tell the crew start rowing, but give it zero pressure. Like, do not give any pressure. Have the boat going as slow as possible. So you're moving forward. You're trying not to get disqualified. But that boat in front of you is taking off at full speed and you are just kind of, you know, chugging along. And then when you can kind of feel like you're about to get disqualified because you're getting screamed at by the starter, then you pick it up on the pressure and you go. Again, it's a little bit risky. I've never been disqualified, but you can certainly get disqualified for doing that too much and giving too much room to the boat in front of you. But I try and give as much room as I can to the boat in front of me. Again, that just gives my crew the best water they can. And if we are going to have to pass somebody, we do it a little bit later in the race, so we will have gotten some runway underneath us before it happens. Again, know what you're doing if you're going to try and do that, because you don't want to upset the starter too much, but just food for thought. Let your rowers know what's going on. So give them enough information so that they don't feel like they have to be looking around and saying, like, where are we in the course? Who's around us? How fast are we going, etc. But try not to give them unnecessary information. You don't need to repeat 7 times that you're coming up on, you know, the Lars Anderson Bridge. They got it. You told them once or twice. They're good. You know, trust them that they heard you the first time. So about steering, this final bullet point is sort of talking about steering. Steering a head race can be tricky, especially if it's like your first couple of times doing it. So there are buoys that mark the inside of essentially every turn. It's rare that the turn is just going to be the shoreline. Most of the time there's going to be buoys that you have to stay on the outside of and you turn around the buoys. If you're just starting out as a new or relatively younger coxswain, you want to keep everything, your oars, your boat, your riggers, everything on the outside of the buoys, and kind of take the turn a little bit wider and leave maybe 8 or 10 feet, if you're measuring it that way, on the outside of the buoys, and kind of make the turn that way. As you get more experienced, you can put your oars on the inside of the buoys and your boat on the outside. Your boat is what matters, not the oars. But having said that, that means that when the oars cross over the buoys, a couple of the rowers might hit a buoy as they're squaring up, and that could cause it to emergency feather and then maybe catch a crab or something. So let the rowers know you're doing that. If you're gonna cut a turn, put the starboard oars or the port oars over the buoys and try and take a turn a little bit sharper. Let them know so they could grip the oars maybe a little bit more firmly or tap down a little bit more to give themselves more clearance. And then after the race, give them time to cool down. So like we talked about, speech fluctuations and things like that, speech patterns, calm everything down, make sure everybody's okay, make sure everyone is safe. No one had like a medical emergency or anything in your boat. And I try and turn the Cox box off and just let them experience the next couple of minutes. They don't need to hear from me. They are in a ton of pain. Just sort of let them be. You are there for support. If somebody needs something from you, you are there, you got them. But unless it's an emergency instruction, I try and keep that to a minimum. Know the docking traffic pattern. Again, you have that down because you studied the race map ahead of time, but know the traffic pattern. And also know the rules related to objecting or challenging. So if you did have to pass a crew or a crew tried to pass you and something happened, you clashed oars, one of you hit a bridge, whatever the case may be, know what has to happen. Do you have to object or challenge the result while you're on the water? Meaning you have to raise your hand, you have to get an official over to you, and then once you get on land, it's over, you've lost your opportunity? Or can you do it on land? That's kind of one of the big differences. So if you have to do it on the water, you have to know that going into it, so that if something does happen on the water, that's on you. You raise your hand, you bring an official over, you explain to them what happened, you file an official challenge or whatever the case may be. I have never challenged a result. I've had 2 results challenged against me. One of them we got disqualified, which was not my fault, but I'm not going to go into that story. The other one we did not get disqualified, and that was on the head of the Charles. So a boat passed us, said that we did not yield to them properly, and filed an official challenge. And during the investigation, they discovered that we did yield properly. The other coxswain just did not take the right course, and in turn had to, if anyone sort of knows the course well, and we're going to see it in a second, they had to go through the right-hand arch in the Elliott Bridge, and they were just upset about that, but that was not my fault. So we ended up getting cleared and nothing happened. So, but they had to know at what time do you need to file that objection or whatever. Again, that's the coxswain's job. So
can I just
let's
make
close. Yeah, Katie, go
Um,
ahead. Sorry.
just for the novice coxswains out there, this might seem like simple to some people. I just want to make it really clear that when you finish a head race, you cannot let your rowers stop. Like, even if you're past the finish line, you have to get like at least 100, 200 meters away, depending on the race, obviously, because some rowers are, or not some rowers, some officials will be screaming at you, especially if you're not moving quickly. And it is a dangerous position if you're just hanging out and you will get disqualified.
Yeah, great point, Katie. I'm looking at some of the questions here that are in the chat. There's some really good ones, and Katie and Rena are giving some really good answers. There is one there, a question about how to practice turns if you don't have a chance to practice on the course. I've been in that situation, and for the head of the Charles, actually. And what we did was, it was the first time I coxed the head of the Charles, and I had never been there before. Obviously, my coach had. So what we did was we had landmarks on our home course, and I asked him, all right, sort of how sharp is the Weeks Bridge turn? How sharp is the Elliott Bridge turn? And we practiced sort of sharp turns, full rudder to starboard and then full rudder to port through this little bridge that was in our on our practice waterway in high school. And we would just do that at speed every day at the end of practice. And that was the way that I practiced sort of going down the course. Was we rehearsed it every single day, even though we weren't on the Charles. We sort of had that visual of full rudder, maybe 8 strokes straight, and then another full rudder, just so I could get the feel for it, and then the rowers could get the feel for it as well. So we're a little bit past an hour. I do want to go through some head of the Charles specific points, if everyone's okay continuing on just for a little bit longer, and then if there are any questions to close, I'm cool continuing on. So I'm cool to keep going. So getting a little bit more specific on the head of the Charles itself. So like I said, I think I've coxed the head of the Charles 7 times. Every time was completely different, and brought different challenges. The one thing that remained consistent, though, is it's loud. It is a very loud course for everyone who has not been there before. There's a lot of spectators, particularly at certain parts of the course. So you can prepare your crew for that, and you can use that. So maybe during the loud stretches, you're not trying to scream over the crowd, and instead you're letting the crowd be the motivation. But having said that, there are quiet stretches. So there are stretches on that course where there aren't going to be a lot of spectators. And I'm thinking particularly that long turn that's about 600 meters leading into the Elliott Bridge after the Lars Anderson Bridge. It can get really kind of quiet and lonely over there. And it's right around right past the 2 mile mark. So your rowers are hurting, the volume comes down, and it's a long turn. So things kind of might lull a little bit there. So plan accordingly. What calls are you going to make in that stretch when the volume comes down, the intensity comes down, and you can kind of refocus things a little bit. Again, safety first. The course itself can be a little hectic. It's not uncommon to have to go through one bridge arch with like 3 4s or 3 8s wide. So you just sort of have to know who's on your port, who's on your starboard, If you're coming up on crews, maybe not the first 1 or 2 bridges, but certainly as you get into the back half of the race, it can definitely stack up a little bit. So between bridges going around turns, it can get a little chaotic. You have to remember safety first. If you are about to endanger your crew's safety, even at the expense of going faster, safety is your number one priority. It is not worth it to run into a bridge just because that's the faster course, or have a clash of oars that might end up slowing you down way more than maybe just dialing it back for 5 or 10 strokes. Have your crew throw in a pause, even like whatever the case may be, to get through a situation safely rather than like super aggressively. And then lastly, you want to make sure you have the right equipment. So if you don't have a head racing rudder on your boat, get one. And a head racing rudder is going to be about twice the size of a normal rudder. And for everyone sort of just starting out, if you flip a boat over, there's 2 things that stick out of the bottom of the boat. One is the skeg, and the skeg is permanently attached. It does not move, and it's just a triangle. And then behind the skeg is the rudder. The rudder is the thing that moves, and that's what you steer. The rudder is maybe the size of like a business card or like a credit card. You can get them that are like twice that big or more, and that's specifically made for head racing. And it means that you have a lot more power to move the boat. So if you can get a head racing rudder, get one. But it's sort of like going from a Honda Civic to a Ferrari. Like when you go full rudder, you're going to feel it, and the back of that boat is going to power slide around that turn. So I would definitely practice with it going full rudder, half rudder, whatever the case may be, to sort of understand what the reaction is. The Head of the Charles has a really good instructional video on their website, and the link is here. So when you get this presentation, you'll be able just to click on this. But I would watch the instructional video, and it's maybe like 20 minutes long, but they do a good job of going through the entire course, going through the warm-up, sort of the race structure, the warm-up patterns, the starting cue, all of that. So you can kind of have a sense for what to expect. And then we're going to take a look at the course. Before we do that, I'll pause here and kind of see Katie and Rena, if you have anything to add, just sort of generally before we get into talking about the specific course stuff.
I do want to add something. So Jimmy mentioned that the Head of the Charles is like much louder than other courses. And I would say that one thing that was really important for my boat approaching the Head of the Charles was making sure that I, as a coxswain, wasn't being too loud, because your voice is going to echo, like, especially through the bridges. And my rowers, who were all like really experienced and had been to the Head of the Charles before, knew that like they've heard coxswains making moves before. And if you hear a coxswain making a move on you, obviously you're not going to let that happen. So the word of the day for me was stealth, because you want to be really quiet and not like reveal what you're doing to other crews.
That's a great point. There's a question in the chat about head racing rudders, and it says, are they only suggested for the Head of the Charles or other head races too? Excuse me. And I would say every head race. I always ask for a head racing rudder. The only downside is that the boat's going to be more responsive to it. So number one, it's going to turn faster, which means it's going to get offset a little bit more than a regular rudder. So you want to be experienced with it, and you're not going to go like full rudder a lot. You're not going to need to, but your rowers need to be ready to expect that. So you need to be a little bit more communicative if you have a head racing rudder on there, to tell them, all right, I'm going to be going on the rudder in 3, in 2, in 1, on this one. You start to make your turn, and then they know, all right, the boat might sink a little bit to the outside, just when you're going on the rudder, because it's going to have a larger impact. So that's sort of really the only downside to head racing rudders, in my opinion. They're going to slow you down a little bit more because it's just a little bit more drag, but if you're going straight, the drag is really negligible. It's only when you're on the rudder. So this is the Head of the Charles course. And in the interest of time, I sort of want to explain what you're looking at here. And there are videos. So each of the what are like kind of in purple, those are hyperlinks to the section of the Head of the Charles official race video that talk about that bridge or that section of the race course. So when you get this, you can just click on that and it'll take you right to that. I was going to go through each of those, but we're kind of running short on time. So I'll kind of just talk you through the course and pause and maybe have a discussion about the big parts of the course. So the bottom right is where you're going to start. The boats launch near the finish line. So when you look at the Head of the Charles course, you kind of refer to everything on the top as the Harvard side, or the Cambridge side. I've heard it referred to as, so like Cambridge side, Harvard side, up on sort of the north side of the course, up here, if you can see my mouse. And then everything down is the Boston side. So the reason why it's not just called like the right or the left is because you're traveling north for one part of the race and south for the other one. So it's just easy to remember everything on this side is the Boston side, everything on this side is the Cambridge side or the Harvard side. So you're going to launch right near the finish line on the Boston side of the course. It's here. If you travel to the Head of the Charles, if you have a boathouse there, obviously this doesn't apply to you. And you're going to warm up and you're going to practice on the right-hand side, so near the Boston side, all the way to the starting line. So you're just going to hug the shore all the way around and come all the way down, get through here. And then once you get into this basin, it's just counterclockwise. And there's like 4 really big triangular buoys out there that mark the corners, and you just kind of go around those buoys. And that's your warm up. So the day before, it's the same launching point from the day before. So you just launch, you do your practice, you do your run through the course. And then on the day of, same thing. Once you're ready to start, you're going to line up here. They line the crews up sort of in according to their bound number. So you have to find the crews that are around your bound number. If you're bound number 10, for example, you want to find like bound number 9, bound number 8, bound number 11, 12, and you can kind of know where you need to be. And then they'll just start calling you up around the time of your the start of the race. So you're going to start heading west toward the BU bridge, which is right here. It's actually 2 bridges in one. It sort of looks like one bridge as you're approaching it, but it's really 2 bridges. You're going to come through there. And in the video, it shows you which bridge arch you can go through and which you can't. For the first 3 bridges, you can go through either of the 2 right arches. And then as you get into the week, I think in weeks, actually, you can get on the right one too, but it's not recommended. But anyway, you want to start going through. So you're going to go through the BU bridge. You have a long turn here. It's kind of sneaky long. It doesn't, the turns that get more attention on this course are in the back half of the race. This turn, it's a little bit sharper than you think, and it's a little bit longer than you think. And this is one where you're going to see crews maybe try and put their oars over the buoy line, like we talked about before, which is going to line you up for the powerhouse stretch. The powerhouse stretch is really the only straightaway on the Head of the Charles course. So from right about the Riverside Boat Club, which is the end of this turn, to the start of the Weeks Footbridge, this is a straight course. It's maybe 1,000 or so meters. And there are 2 bridges to go under. Each of these 2 bridges, you can go through either the center arch or the right arch. And then the left arch obviously is traffic coming the other way. I think there's only 3 arches. But you want to go through either the center or the right. To me, there's really no difference if you go through the center or the right. A lot of coxswains will go through the center, but if you do go through the right arch, that actually sets you up a little bit better for the Weeks Bridge, because you can belly out a little bit and be wider coming into it. So it may bring you around a little bit farther on this turn, but you won't see a lot of coxswains do it. But you can take a good line and still be in that right-hand set of arches here. I'll pause here before we get into talking about weeks and see if Katie or Rena, if you have any thoughts about the start and powerhouse stretch.
I would say just recognize that, like, for example, I rode at Saugatuck for the majority of my junior career. We are on a bay. We're not on like a river like this. there aren't like bridges that we're constantly going through. In practice, we go through them and then we practice. So one thing that was different for my rowers was there's like a lot of stone walls like along like the bridges, and it's like more narrow, and there's more of an effect to the water than you would see at Saugatuck, which is what we're used to. So like it really depends on the condition for the race, but like the more experienced coxswain to me reminded me like to like tell my rowers that they have to get ready for like the stone wall effect to the water at like the beginning of the race, where it's going to be coming more like at like the sides of your boat than like with it in a sense.
I mean, I'm obviously I row in the Charles, so I have the advantage of like 3 times a week we like at least we get up to the start of the head of the Charles course. Like my rowers are really familiar with the course. So I mean, this is really specific to like boats and clubs that are like practicing heavily on the Charles, is like you're familiar with where you are. So like I do head of the Charles time trials all the time with my team to see race rowers and coxswains, and it's just important like if you have like they know the turns, like especially if you practice the day before, like just like remind them like where they're at in the race, be like we're coming around this turn, like get ready, like warn them in advance, like talk them through what they already know is coming, just so that like nothing's like a surprise. Because like head of the Charles, as everyone's been saying, is like it can get really loud, it can get really hectic, but like as you're coming through the BU bridge, just get them ready for that like turn, like just be ready, like stay calm and just keep giving them information when it feels like they need it.
Totally. And I would echo sort of what Katie was saying, and like that sort of the seawall effect, particularly in the powerhouse stretch. And the reason why that is because it's the only stretch of the course where there are cement walls on both sides. So if you've ever gone underneath a bridge that has like cement abutments, you know that like wakes can kind of come back and forth and that water can get really unstable underneath you. That's the feeling you're going to have for the 3 minutes going through the powerhouse stretch here, because both walls on both sides of the race course are cement. So the wakes from every boat in front of you are going to be coming back and forth, and it can get really bouncy. So one thing that we used to do was sort of understand it's not going to feel great for these like 3 or 3.5 minutes. But when the seawalls end coming around here and it just becomes like shoreline again, just kind of grass and stones or whatever, then you get a little bit flatter water as you get through the Western Avenue Bridge here approaching Weeks. The water flattens out a little bit. So what we used to do was a focus 10 on setting the boat up. So really controlling our finishes, finishing high, setting the boat up, getting a stable platform again, because it was just hectic coming through with powerhouse stretch. It was like you were on the ocean, and then all of a sudden it's going to flatten out here. So as you come into the Weeks footbridge, I am going to play this video for a second and sort of show what it's going to look like for everyone who hasn't been there. If you've only been there maybe once or twice, to get a refresher on what it looks like approaching and maybe coming into and out of the Weeks Bridge.
Of Lowell House at Harvard University, which coxswains and scullers will be able to see. If you follow that line, it will bring you towards the Cambridge side, the starboard side of the bridge. Both arches of the Weeks footbridge are open, though it is advised to use only the right-hand arch to avoid a crash. The best crews approach this bridge by swinging wide to starboard before entering the Weeks arch. After you come through the Weeks bridge, you will need to turn very hard toward the Boston side, the port side, as you exit.
The Weeks footbridge is at the end of the powerhouse stretch, and so you have 700, 800, 900 meters of straightaway going into it. So for especially the cox boats, I try to make sure that the coxswain takes a look at what's happening in front of them and tries to position themselves in a situation that they can get a clean turn, a turn going through the Weeks bridge that sets them up and they don't get pushed out. If you approach
so that's sort of what it looks like going into the Weeks bridge there. And one of the things about the Weeks bridge, and maybe ask for Rena's advice, because I'm sure she's done this way more than I have, is the apex of the turn for the Weeks bridge is actually before the bridge. So you want to be on the rudder well ahead of the bridge. So everyone kind of thinks that the bridge is the apex and you do half the turn before the bridge and half the turn after the bridge. That's not the case for weeks. You want to be like 80% on your turn by the time you go through the bridge. So you don't go through the bridge perpendicular to the bridge. You kind of are turned ahead of the bridge and you're taking more of a line on this path rather than up kind of in the northwest angle. You want to be headed more west by the time you get through the bridge. Rena, is that your experience, being sort of more experience on that river?
Yeah, definitely. I was just gonna add, like, the biggest mistake that I've seen my teammates go, I've run like 2 to 4 eights like together in a practice coming through weeks going upstream. And like the biggest problem is when you assume that that weeks is the climax of the turn. Because what my old coach, he doesn't work with my team anymore, but what he would always say is, right as you come out of the powerhouse stretch, you want to get ready to position yourself where you have a line from Weeks to Lars Anderson. Like, you want to be ready as you're coming out of Weeks with a vision of Anderson. You're obviously not going to be able to take it directly straight because you're going to have stuff like going on, but you don't want to come out of Weeks with a huge portion of the turn left to make. You want to come in prepared and with your line. And if you're going to make an adjustment, you know exactly where you're going. Like, when I come through Weeks, like, I generally take it pretty aggressively because like I'm comfortable with that part of the river. And like I come through and I have my line and then I adjust to get ready for Anderson based on the boats that are around me. But yeah, it's super, super important, especially when you're at speed coming through Weeks. You don't want to be like coming in to Weeks like ready to take the turn. You want to have taken the hardest part of the turn so that you come through Weeks relatively calm and then you're ready to cut it to starboard to get over to Anderson.
Yeah, and I would totally echo that. And that's, if you stand on the Weeks Bridge and watch some races come through, then you'll see coxswains turn too late. And you can kind of see it when it's happening. And the coxswains that go a little bit wider coming in and start their turn early, they're way more set up to approach Lars Anderson, which is the next bridge. One of the things I will say between Weeks and Lars Anderson is, and it's a little nuanced, so follow me for a second. The buoy line between Weeks and Lars Anderson goes way closer to the Boston side than you want to be. So when you come through Weeks, if you follow the buoy line, because the buoy line's on the inside of the turn, so you're thinking, I need to stay on the inside, I need to keep the buoys, keep my port oars tight against the buoys. If you do that, you're going to be going way closer to the Boston side than you want. You can come off the buoy line as you come out of the Weeks Bridge so that you have a straight shot on the Lars Anderson Bridge. So trust that you're going to the middle arch of the next bridge, and the buoy line is going to get farther away from you as you go between Weeks and Lars Anderson. And I think that's what this video clip shows.
Begin to think about how you will
so
need
this
to
is the Lars Anderson Bridge. So when you come out of Weeks, this is a little bit closer, but when you come out of Weeks, this is what it's going to look like. And if you see the buoy line, it's all the way over here to the left. I mean, it's 30, 40 meters to the left, to the port side of where you are. So if you follow the buoy line, and if you stand on either of these two bridges, you're going to see coxswains do this. They come out of Weeks and they hug the buoys all the way on the left on the port side. And they just take this turn way too wide. You want to be targeted right on this corner here. So the left side of this first abutment of the Lars Anderson Bridge, and that's your target coming out of Weeks. So when you have a line on there, you stop turning and you just go a straight shot from Weeks to right here. And right when you're lined up on here, you stop turning. If you keep going and follow the buoy line, you're going to add 6, 7, 8 seconds to your time unnecessarily. The Lars Anderson turn is sharp. It's really sharp, but it's really short. It's probably only like 6 or 7 strokes. It's full rudder. It's a quick turn, but you can do it sort of in the moment. You don't have to set up for it as much as you do with the Weeks Bridge.
Also, just
after Lars,
go
ahead.
You don't do the opposite of that. I've seen a lot of coxswains take the Weeks turn too wide and stop turning too early, and then they end up like too close to the Harvard boathouse. You want to really point yourself towards that abutment. Don't take the starboard side.
Yep. Great point. So after you come through Lars Anderson, there's another straightaway here where you're going to go through the 2 mile mark. So you're 2/3 through the course right here. 1 mile mark is halfway through the powerhouse stretch. Another mile gets you to just past the Lars Anderson Bridge. And there's maybe 40 strokes or so between the Lars Anderson Bridge, this straightaway, and then you're going to get into what I call the Elliott Bridge turn. I don't know if there's a more formal term for it, but it's the turn here that's long that leads into the Elliott Bridge turn. This straightaway here, this is a point in the race where sometimes speed is going to lag. You're through the Weeks Bridge. It gets very loud. This is the loudest part of the course right here because all of the tents and exhibition and expo and everything's on here. These 2 bridges are packed. Excuse me. And when you get past the Lars Anderson Bridge, past the 2 mile mark, it's going to really quiet down. So in here, you might start to see speed lag. That's when your job is going to get really important in terms of what calls you're making and to sustain the speed that you had when everyone was all, jazzed up going through this loud part of the course. There's maybe I think it's like 600 meters or so turn that's to the port side. It's pretty hard. And the difficult part about this turn is it's a turn to port and it's a continuing turn and it gets sharper and sharper as you go. So it gets more and more aggressive and you're going to need more and more rudder as you go around this turn. So it starts out with maybe 50 or 60% rudder. By the very end here, you're at full rudder to make it in this final little turn here as you approach the Elliott Bridge. Technically, I think this is the most difficult turn on the course. A lot of people think the Weeks Bridge is. For me, I've just always am stressed approaching the Elliott Bridge turn because I always think I'm full rudder already. How the heck am I going to make the final, 5 or 6 strokes before the Elliott Bridge? It works out every time, but it can be a little daunting as you're coming into this turn at full rudder and you're like, I wish I had more rudder here. And let's kind of see what that looks like going into the Elliott Bridge.
Quarters and the VIP director's tent coming into view. Keep following the orange buoys, but set yourself up for the upcoming Elliott Bridge. Again, it's not so important how you enter the bridge as how you exit. You want to be on an angle toward the starboard side, toward the Belmont Hill dock, which is just after the Elliott Bridge on the right. You can still be hugging the orange buoys as you begin coming past the Cambridge Boat Club on the right. Expect lots of noise here from the announcers.
So I'm going
to
pause here for a second to just point something out. So there is a dock right after the Elliott Bridge. It's going to be on your starboard side here. There are a few buoys right outside of this dock, and that's the inside of the last turn. So when you come through, you're going to be hard to port coming into the Elliott Bridge. As soon as you get a line on this outside buoy right here, that's your line. That's when you come off the rudder and then you take the most aggressive line you can that's straight shot from the apex of this Elliott Bridge turn through the Elliott Bridge to the apex of the next turn, which is to starboard, which is your final turn. And I think it's like only 3 or 4 buoys that stick out past this dock right here, but that's your point coming through the Elliott Bridge.
Try to go through at the left side of the center arch for the best line. The right-hand arch is also open, but it's not advised unless you need an escape route to avoid collision. Now coming straight out of the Elliott Bridge toward the Belmont Hill dock on the right. This is the straightest course and the preferred course. It is sometimes wise to hold back on the other side of the Elliott Bridge so you can get this inside
It's
line.
kind of subtle, but you can see it here in the video. That's kind of what the buoy looks like. There's not a lot to it. And all of them are kind of that size. It's like sticking out of the water. It's maybe the size of like a can of soda. They're not very big, but when you pick that up, that you want your hull just on the outside of that because that's the apex of the turn going into the final straightaway. So that's this turn right here. And this is the final turn going toward the finish line. The only real thing that I have to say about the finish line, and I'll kind of end with this, is when you turn to point toward the finish line, there's going to be 2 big orange or yellow buoys they should be yellow, right at the finish line, two big triangles that just kind of say finish, or it might be 3 miles or whatever the case is, but that'll mark the finish line. When you come around this final turn, the shortest line is going to be toward just inside of the left or the port side buoy. So don't overturn. Again, it's sort of the same thing like I talked about coming through weeks. So when you come through this final turn, the tendency is going to be turn too much and hug the shoreline and attack the buoy that's on the Cambridge side. But the straightest line is going to be turn as soon as you have a straight shot on the buoy that's closer to the Boston side. That's your straightest line going in toward the finish line. And then you finish, obviously, come down here, turn around, and then back up toward the finish line. There's a lot of questions in the chat that I see. There's one question in there that are talking about what segments to break up the course in, and I think that's super interesting, and I want to address that. But I'll just pause for a second and let Katie and Rena kind of add to anything I've said, or maybe correct anything that I've said that you disagree with.
I just have two really random points to make about this course. So first of all, I have a lot of people asking the Coxswain Resources page about like buoys and like going over buoys or like hitting your oar with a buoy. And I just want to say, like, these buoys at the Charles, well, most of them, not like the finish line or anything, it's not like a huge deal if you like have your rowers like shaft like go over them. Like, they're not going to break their nose or anything. And I would say a lot of experienced rowers, especially if you're like a new coxswain on the course, will kind of expect that a buoy might be like gone over in the wrong way. The only way that it really matters is if you're like, or like catches it in a way that it like pushes it off the course. And if the officials see that, then they could dock like seconds off on your time for that. I wouldn't say that I know anyone that's happened to, but it's possible. And then you also just want to be careful around the big turn. They'll like read more about this, but there's like the red buoys that you can go over and then the white buoys that you can't go over because the warm-up is too close. So you just want to be careful that you're tugging that tight but not going over the white buoys, which would probably be kind of hard to do. And then just weeks, I feel like a lot of coxswains don't think about this. So everyone's worried about going through weeks when you're on the course, but a lot of coxswains don't think about going through weeks when you're coming to the start line and you're warming up. And I would say that the thing that I heard the most all throughout Charles weekend last year was the poor official that had to stand on weeks and scream at all of the coxswains that were taking that turn too wide and not like holding it sharp going around, because I would say it's actually sharper going towards the start line than it is going through the course. So you just want to really be on your game. Do not think that you could go all 8 through that turn. The officials will be screaming at you all through Anderson to Weeks to tell you to stop. And I would say that if you really want to like make your team look good to the officials, you want to be making that turn without having them yell at you. And like one of the things that I like to flex on is that when I went through that turn, the official said, "Coxswain, good job." Not, "Coxswain, you have to stop rowing, stop rowing, stop rowing," which is what they mainly say there.
Yeah, Katie, definitely that's all. So it's stuff that I would agree with. And then I just want to say, like, after Elliott, when you're coming past the boat club that's directly on your right, my coaches always have us hone in on like get as close to those, have your starboard oars as like those blades as close to the buoys as you can get them, because that means you're like hugging it tight. You've made Elliott turn right. And then once you get through the apex of that turn, like Jimmy was saying, you want to have a straight shot towards the end of the course. But just like it's important to get to finish.
Mom, can you take my phone real quick?
To finish that turn strong and then to just continue through the rest of the course straight.
Totally. I totally agree with all of that. That it just reminded me of a couple quick things that I'll just cover real quick before we wrap up. And that is the warm up from like Katie was saying. So from the time you launch here, basically until you get through the starting line, it's single file. So you're going to be warming up. If you're in a youth 8 or something, you're going to be warming up, and there might be 4s or doubles or something in front of you, and you are going single file for 3 miles. And it can be a little bit of like stopping and starting and stopping and starting. So it's sort of more of like a varsity level type scheme to it, but have a drill in your warm up where the boat goes slow on that drill. So what we used to do was kind of an exaggerated cut the cake, like by 4s in an 8. So, they would take a full stroke and then they would come all the way up to half slide, go all the way back to the finish, and then go all the way back up and take another stroke. And the boat's going to go really slow when you do that drill, but it keeps them moving because you're going single file. So you don't have to keep saying rowing by 8 for 8 strokes and then let it run. And then you're just waiting for, a minute, and then you pick it up again by 8, and then you weigh enough and you come to a full stop again. So to avoid that, you can have kind of a pre-rehearsed pause type drill in your warm up to avoid a little bit of that stopping and starting. I would say, so there's one question in the chat that's about how to break up the course. I would say, talk to your crew about that. Kind of print out the map and sit down during maybe a week, 2 weeks before the race and kind of just chat about how they want to break it up. And then they have a little bit more buy-in to that process, and they can kind of say, yeah, we want to really focus on so the way I used to break it up was, starting 30 or 40 through the bridge here was kind of just no man's land. So we didn't really break that up. And then you have the Magazine Beach turn, which is this first turn. So that was kind of the first, first chunk. Powerhouse stretch was the chunk. Weeks Bridge going into Lars, that was a chunk. And then this long turn was a chunk. And then Elliott to the finish line was a chunk. And from Elliott to the finish line was just a slow build. And you kind of knew, all right, you have maybe 650-ish meters left from Elliott to the finish line. I think that's about right. But you can kind of know, all right, we have maybe 220 left or so on the race. So we're going to pick up the rate like every 20 or 30 seconds. We're going to go up a beat, like that kind of thing. You have that practiced so that after you come off the rudder for this turn, your crew knows what the build is going to be. I'm trying to look into the chat to ask or to answer some of these questions before we wrap up. I don't think there are weigh-ins at the head of the Charles. Rena and Katie, do you have any other information on that? I've never been weighed in.
No way.
Yeah, there are no weigh-ins.
Yeah, I didn't think so. Okay. I've actually I've never coxed a 4 down the Charles. So Katie and Rena, have you, and maybe can you talk about a little bit about what's different coxing a 4 versus an 8 at the Charles?
Yeah, so last year I was lucky enough to be in a 4 and an 8 at the Charles because I coxed the Director's Challenge 8, which is really cool. And if you get the opportunity to, it's definitely an experience you want to have. But I would say that what I learned from an older coxswain, even before I coxed the Charles, was that she has lots of records on this course, and she always wants to be in a 4 at the Charles because the way that you're looking at the blades in a 4 makes the boat seem narrower than if you were in an 8 and you were looking at the blades. So then you naturally take sharper turns and you're cutting more corners than you would be in an 8 because you're not playing it as safe and the boat looks smaller to you. So that's one thing that if you're in a 4 or a smaller boat, you're probably going to be steering. I know for my course, I steered a shorter course in the 4 than an 8. And that also has to do with the size of the boat. So an 8 takes longer to respond to steering usually because the boat is longer. So 4s are really quick to steer around. They're shorter. So weeks will be easier. I think I only took maybe 2 or 3 pressure strokes to get around weeks, when I think I took 5 or 6 to get in the 8. So it is a little different there. You'll have to give your boat more time to respond if you're in an 8.
Yeah, taking a 4 down the Charles is drastically easier. And I've found like, and I've gone, like I've raced both directions and I've like just done skill and drill like in both directions. And especially around Weeks and Elliott, the 4, it just responds so much more quickly. So I remember last season or in last fall, we entered a bunch of boats, but 2 of the boats were a Coxed quad and an 8 in our Charles lineups. And the quad, it was so much easier to steer. Like the 8 was a lot more difficult because like Katie said, like you're with the perception that you have of the blades, like you cut turns a little bit less tight. And it's also the boat responds so much more slowly. So like Elliott is so much more difficult in a big boat than in a small boat. So I just say if you're in a 4 or a Coxed quad, it's like a lot. It's like the boat's more responsive. It's not that it's easier, but like it's definitely better because like the boat's going to respond to you more quickly and more easily. But the one thing to highlight is that you have to make sure, especially around the turns when people are trying to make moves on you and to pass you need to make sure your bow seat knows to communicate to you what's going on. I've had great bow seats that like communicate everything to me, and I've had bow seats that completely forget to do that, and that can just be like a really important safety issue. So like be happy if you're coxing a small boat, and also make sure that your bow seat knows their responsibility.
100%. Yeah, that's a great point, Rena.
Can I add to that?
Go ahead, Katie. Yeah.
This is just because I responded to a question about bowing. I guess there's someone that's a rower in this conversation, which is really nice to see. My brother was a rower and he was bow seat in a double the Charles last year, and all of these points that we just talked about do apply to you. So you don't have to think that you wasted your time or anything. They do apply to you. I would say, again, it's just like a 4. You'll be able to cut the course a little tighter than you would if you were coxing an 8. And the only difference is that I guess it depends on what I know. The boats at Saugatuck, they do not have toe steering in doubles. So my brother was like completely pressure and on one of his sides. So you'll probably have a lot more pressure on one side than the other. But if you are lucky enough to have toe steering, then you'll be able to do that too.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I would say if you don't, for whoever asked that question, if you are towing your way down the course, I would say if you don't have the opportunity to row the course a lot, then on your home course, practice 30 stroke segments with 10 strokes being full rudder or full pressure to port, 10 strokes straight, and then 10 strokes full rudder to starboard. So like hardest turn you can go to the left, and then 10 strokes going straight, and then the hardest turn you can go back to the right. And that's going to mimic a couple of the turns that you'll see on the course. And if you can do that kind of like full one way, straighten out, full the other way, if you can get that down, if you're in like a double or a quad with your crew, you'll be set up to do well on this course. So we've kept everybody 44 minutes past the hour. So we'll go ahead and break soon. If anyone has any questions, you can feel free to shoot either, sorry about that, the Coxswain Clinic, which is my page on Instagram or emails, or CoxswainResources. You can DM questions there at any time. I will say that I offer sort of what I refer to as like personal training services for coxswains, which you'll see on your screen here. If you're interested in any one of these, shoot me a DM or an email, and we could talk about sort of how these work. If you want to get like a specific race recording done, or if you're local or drivable within the DC area, which is where I'm located, I can actually come and kind of like watch your practice and give you sort of direct feedback or general things like that. And you can hit up me or, like I said, CoxswainResources with sort of questions about Head of the Charles and beyond. So with that, thank you everybody for attending and good luck this season and at the Head of the Charles. Thanks, Katie, and thanks, Rena. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, and if anyone wants to stay on and ask questions,